When we talk about the Taíno, few people even know what we're talking about. Everyone knows the Aztec, everyone knows the Inca, everyone knows the Maya. You mention Taíno and they go, who are these people?
The name Taíno itself is the generic term for the late prehistoric peoples of the Greater Antilles and the Bahamas, the Big Islands, Cuba, Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, and Jamaica.
In terms of national identity, the people in Dominican Republic think of themselves as Indians, not as people of African ancestry.
These are the people that greeted Columbus. When Columbus arrived in the New World, there were several million Taíno already here, living in the Greater Antilles.
Knowing more about the Taínos will help us understand that clash of cultures.
You have two worlds that didn't have previous knowledge of each other coming together and initially misunderstanding each other fundamentally because they are trying to fit them into the world as they understood it, when in fact this was something totally new and unprecedented.
There was a large number of indigenous population, the Taíno, that were decimated, assimilated, or just disappeared within the first 10 to 20 years of contact with the New World.
Caves have a very special role in Taíno culture. They are sort of the way that this world is physically connected to the underworld where the spirits of the dead dwell. The Taínos believed humans were created in two caves. The Taíno people came from one cave, and all the non-Taíno people came from another cave.
The Padre Nuestro complex of caverns is really 4 water-filled caverns and then several others that are land.
And it's one of only now 9 sites known with early stone materials.
When I look at Padre Nuestro, what I look at is its implications for the actual people in the Caribbean, which is one of the last places in the world that was inhabited. So 4,000 to 6,000 years ago, we know people came into the Caribbean. The question is, where did they come from? Probably the first wave coming into the Greater Antilles came from the mainland, probably Yucatan, by boat. Came across, inhabited Cuba, inhabited Dominican Republic, and we have evidence of that.
The Manantial de la Aleta, I think, has a special place among caves and caverns in that it has a very vertical, a direct vertical connection from a watery pool, a watery underworld, if you will, through the surface of the earth to the heavens.
And the only way you can explain these objects that date from 600 years before Columbus contact right up to the time of Columbus is that they were offered underwater and they were preserved there in an anaerobic, no oxygen, very little sunlight penetrating, and that's La Aleta. It has the largest diversity of Taíno objects of organic and ceramic that we've seen anywhere else, and they were all placed there on purpose. They were all offered to the gods, the inner world.
What conception they had of a broader world beyond that, we don't know.
Christopher Columbus was not an accident. His voyage into the New World were the result of many historical processes. By 1492, the last kingdom of Granada is won by the Christians. And it is actually at that point that Christopher Columbus is able to gain the support of Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand for his voyage to the New World.
What he was looking for above all was to become the founder of a good family, one that would have titles and privileges and renown down through the ages.
When we think of Columbus's first voyage, I mean, everyone knows Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. He came with the Nini, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. But not everybody knows that the first shipwreck of the Americas was the Santa Maria. And the Santa Maria ran gently up onto a sandbar reef in present-day Haiti. Well, they couldn't get the ship off the reef, so they had to make a decision.
Columbus was not able, with only the two smaller ships remaining, to bring everybody back to Spain.
They were able to actually use the materials from the now to build a fort called La Navidad.
And he left 39 men and he sailed off.
Columbus was of the idea that there was a lot of gold in that area. What he wanted to do was to have this fort over there so that they could start the trade with these people.
Everyone knew he was coming back. A little over a year later, he comes on the second voyage. He arrives at Navidad. And what's he find? Smoldering timbers. Everyone's dead.
There was a doctor with the group who said they looked like they'd been dead about 2 weeks.
Columbus was thinking about trade, but the Spaniards were thinking about colonization. They actually started to demand some things from the indigenous people, and the indigenous people just did not accept that.
Most probably it was the local Taínos who essentially finally decided they had to get rid of these people because they were too disruptive.
So he knows not to stay there. He elects to go down the coast where he had sailed a year prior in a matter of several days. It takes him 30 more days to make it 80 miles down the coastline, and he pulls into a place, a river, the Bajo Nico River that he had named, and he says, this is it. This is the settlement of Isabella.
They brought a priest, they brought some women, they brought animals, they brought everything they need for a full-fledged colonization.
The sort of backbone of the early Spanish colonial economy was the right to make demands on the labor of the Taínos.
If a Taíno did not want to accept Christianity, that person could be enslaved.
One of the major sources of the writings of Father Las Casas.
He had seen actually in Cuba rivers of blood, of all the indigenous people that were killed, a massacre in the hands of the Spaniards.
They overworked the Taínos in the gold mines and the Spanish plantations. They took them away from their villages and their families at crucial points of the agricultural year.
From then on, we're going to see that there's going to be a major clashes, actually, in which many Spaniards actually died at the hands of the Taínos.
The trigger, at least as the story has come down to us, was when a Spaniard cut off a Taíno's ear on a trumped-up charge of theft.
The Spanish show up with hackbutt rifles, crossbows, horses with soldiers with lances.
But I would say that the most important weapon against the indigenous people was actually disease.
There are accounts of at least some Taínos killing their children and then committing suicide, rather than trying to face a world in which they could no longer cope.
The annihilation of the culture of the Taíno and right in through the Americas is well documented. As small amounts of Spanish made huge influence because of their arms and their weapons and their tactics. They were there to conquer. They were there to make a conquest.
If you look at the major transformations in human history, and I don't care, give me a list, a short list, 5, 8, 10, 12, I don't care how many. You have to include in that list the unification of the old and new worlds into a single world. After that, everything is different from the way it was before. People, plants, animals, diseases, ideas start moving all over the world in this sort of first great sweep of globalization, a word that's much bandied about nowadays. But the real globalization first occurs at the end of the 15th century. In a sense, they are the first people in the path of the hurricane. And they deserve our study and respect for that very reason. Taínos seem to have reacted to the Spanish in different ways.
The Spaniards learned a lot from that first contact in the Caribbean.
Initially, relationships between the Spanish and Taíno were good.
There was a sense of happiness, and in my mind I'm envisioning how it occurred, that when they're having party, they're having small areitos, they're having to celebrate other beings.
Neither side really understood who they were dealing with, who the other was, but they were at least cordial.
They traded with them, that they were scared of them at some point, but that they traded trinkets, that they gave them the guanin, these golden discs that the chieftains wore.
People talk about the Spanish trying to enslave the Taínos because Columbus at one point mentioned they would make good slaves, and I think maybe he had some idea that they could do it, but Queen Isabella nixed it. So these are my subjects, you can't enslave them.
In 1503, Queen Isabella issued an order saying that if an indigenous person, if a Taíno did not want to accept Christianity, that person could be enslaved. If they accept Christianity and they would be working for the Spaniards, they had to pay what would be, could say, like a salary to them.
The sort of backbone of the early Spanish colonial economy was the right to make demands on the labor of the Taínos.
They're seen by the Spaniards as to be servants. They are there to work the mines because the Spaniards only have the thought of gold.
They overworked the Taínos in the gold mines and the Spanish plantations. They took them away from their villages and their families at crucial points of the agricultural year. Penalties for failure to produce are at least depicted as having been severe. I don't doubt that they always were, but you have to understand that a lot of what has come down to us about this period isn't history, it's propaganda. We have depictions of things like people being roasted, of people having their hands chopped off. I'm not saying that those kind of things didn't happen, because I think they did. But I think sometimes the scale gets exaggerated.
At the same time, the conquerors, when they came, they brought priests with them. Okay, these priests, of course, were supposed to minister to them. However, these priests, when they came to the islands, some said good things about them. They fell in love with the Indians, with the indigenous people, but others did not.
One of the major sources of the writings of Father Las Casas. Las Casas, his father and his uncle had been with Columbus at La Isabela.
Las Casas initially came to the New World and was swinging a sword like everyone else, going against the Taíno as ordered. But he saw the visions that these people were being annihilated, and so really their rights, the one person that stood up was Las Casas.
Actually, he's going to make the case that he had seen actually in Cuba rivers of blood, of all the indigenous people that were killed and massacred in the hands of the Spaniards. They're going to be talking about the exploitation of the indigenous people, and that is going to create a whole debate in Spain about whether or not the indigenous people have a soul, if these are actually human beings, people who can actually learn to be Christians.
His writings, which are probably our single most valuable written source on Taíno culture, are very sympathetic to the cause of the Taínos.
Start of the 16th century, 1510, thereabouts. The resistance, the Taíno resistance took place because of the atrocities that were being committed.
From then on, we're going to see that there's going to be a major clashes, actually, in which many Spaniards actually died at the hands of the Taínos.
The trigger, at least as the story has come down to us, was when a Spaniard cut off a Taíno's ear on a trumped-up charge of theft. The Spanish were exploring in the interior, a group of them, and they went to cross a river, and so they took their clothes off to swim across, and the leader then accused Taínos of stealing their clothes. It was a trumped-up charge. Everybody knew it was a trumped-up charge. Everybody knew Taínos did not steal. Nonetheless, this particular Spaniard used this incident as an excuse to cut off a Taíno's ear, and it sort of went downhill from there.
There just wasn't any comparison for doing battle. You would have to side on the side of the old world technology. The Spanish show up with hackbutt rifles, crossbows, large dogs trained as attack dogs, horses with soldiers with lances.
Taíno weapons, they did have bows and arrows, but the weapon that the Spanish say they feared the most, and which the most effective Taíno weapon, was a long club known as a macana. It was said to have been capable of crushing a man's skull even if he were wearing a steel helmet.
We had clubs, we had stones, yes, we had metal, we had knives, but they had weapons that we did not have. They had cannons. That was easy to subjugate us, to subject us to their will. We got nothing out of them except death. and disease. You know, we didn't have syphilis in the Caribbean until Columbus came to the Caribbean. Okay, that was a European disease.
I would say that the most important weapon against the indigenous people was actually disease. They do not know what smallpox is, that you do not know what to do, that you see your faces and your body disfigured. Many people actually died out of that. They did not know that if they rested and got some water and all of that, they could feel better and then keep fighting.
Sort of active armed conflict went on over a span of not quite 10 years.
As atrocities continue to occur by the Spaniards, where they hunted, where they would tear down complete yucayecas, villages of people.
We have accounts of people who found their world so changed, so disintegrating, so unrecognizable that they felt they couldn't go on living in it. And so there are accounts of at least some Taínos killing their children and then committing suicide rather than trying to face a world in which they could no longer cope.
The annihilation of the culture of the Taíno and right in through the Americas is well documented that small amounts of Spanish made huge influence because of their arms and their weapons and their tactics. They were there to conquer. They were there to make a conquest.
In terms of how many Taínos there were in 1492, the estimates range very widely. The low estimate is 60,000. This is for the island of Hispaniola alone. The most common figure you'll see is 1 to 2 million. I think that's a number that seems okay to me, but it really is just a number. I don't think we have a particularly good handle on it.
Maybe there's 1 million. Maybe there was 500,000. The point is there was a large number of indigenous population, the Taíno, that were decimated, assimilated, or just disappeared within the first 10 to 20 years of contact with the New World, the Spanish arrival.
If someone were to ask me to describe the Spanish impact on the Taínos in one word, I would say devastating. But I would not say completely fatal. I don't think the Spanish totally exterminated the Taíno people. Those
that didn't die from disease or from working the mines or being forced into slave labor were assimilated into the African blacks that were being brought in starting in 1511. And so these cultures were becoming intermixed. So I don't think the Taíno are gone. I think they're still here today. Certainly the linguistics are here. We talk about hurricane, Taíno, canoe, Taíno, manatee, Taíno, the word barbecue, Taíno.
There are people who identify themselves as Taíno. The largest and most active groups are in Puerto Rico.
The 2010 census that we just had, there was a 48% increase in people identifying as Taíno on the island in Borinquen. That translates to about 19,000 people.
Been a very important study. It was done now a few years ago under National Science Foundation, University of Puerto Rico, looking at genetics and looking at the traits of Taíno that are in the genome. And certainly we see that. That's not to be unexpected. First they went to remote village areas, then they went just to the general population. And what they found was as many as 60% of the population in Puerto Rico is carrying the genome of the Taíno.
It is my job to go to Cleveland, where there are 44,000 Puerto Ricans. If we go by the statistics, 60% of them are going to have Taíno heritage, Taíno blood in them, Taíno DNA.
They don't live the way Taínos did 500 years ago, but we don't live the way our ancestors did 500 years ago. But they do try to preserve some Taíno traditional knowledge, Taíno dances and music, Taíno beliefs, and so on.
Now we have a resurgence. The resurgence is that we accept who we are as indigenous people. It makes no sense for a nation such as ours to not be aware and not to know what has been done generations past. It isn't meant to be that we are to feel guilty about it, but not to let it happen again.
If you look at the major transformations in human history, and I don't care, give me a short list, 5, 8, 10, 12, I don't care how many. You have to include in that list the unification of the old and new worlds into a single world. After that, everything is different from the way it was before. People, plants, animals, diseases, ideas start moving all over the world in this sort of first great sweep of globalization, a word that's much bandied about nowadays. But the real globalization first occurs at the end of the 15th century. In a sense, they are the first people in the path of the hurricane. And they deserve our study and respect for that very reason.